is, again, this is up to you to use with parents. You may opt to use some of them, not all of them, and we may not go through all of them in the interest of time. But they're written to, some are quite obvious what the error is, some are perfectly fine, and some are intentionally ambiguous to give us the opportunity for discussion with parents and for discussion among professionals to look at what would be the long-term outcome of repeated commands or instructions of this nature. So let's start first with the first one. I want you to pick up the blocks, please. Do you guys think that was fine or anything to change? Fine? The larger group okay with it? Yeah. Cool. Okay. Don't touch that. It belonged to my grandmother. It's been in the family for years. I'd be so upset if something happened to it. So what did you suggest? So just keeping it simple, please don't touch the glass. Okay, do you think giving an explanation is wrong to kids? No. It's just how and when? Okay, so in the immediate sense, if our goal is to try to elicit compliance, keep it simpler and maybe save the explanation for another time as to why that direction was given. Or after they followed the direction. Okay. Fred, go clean up the garage and don't come back in until it's clean.
I think we agree. We think it's both vague and repeated. It's vague in that it's not being specific as to what to do in the garage.
Okay.
And I think it's repeated in the sense that you're not giving the child the opportunity to follow through on what you're asking them to do before you scold them.
Okay, so it's both vague and repeated. Vague is in what specifically needs to happen in the garage, and repeated is you're not giving them the opportunity to even initiate it, and it's just a scolding right away. Yep.
And also here is don't come back until it's clean. It might be clean to him.
Yeah.
So those standards when you're saying that.
Right. So maybe giving more explicit instruction about what clean is, or taking that step of increasing independent time. This might be a command that's given of I need you to go clean up the garage, and then we're intermittently checking on them to see how they're doing in that task.
It's also assuming that the kid's not going to do it, and it's it's kind of punishing already. Not giving him or her the opportunity really to.
So it's communicating the message that don't come back in until it's done. I already presume you're not going to follow through with what I've told you to do. Yeah. And I think it's also making the assumption that the child's of the appropriate developmental age for a task like that. So again, that part of the reason why these are intentionally vague is if you have an adolescent, that might be a perfectly appropriate activity to ask them in, but some parents might be asking inappropriate tasks of kids for their developmental stage, so it allows you the opportunity to strategically use that one. If you have a parent for whom you're concerned, that might be a secondary issue.
We thought that it should be more specific too.
More specific, like what about?
Blank in the garage.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you said the tools away.
Pick up the tools or put the basketballs away.
Right.
Yep.
Whatever they usually.
And then what about put all your puzzles on the closet shelves? You could say please, sure. Yeah. Number 5, our next group. Ronnie, how many times do I have to tell you, don't jump on the bed, get down, now, I mean it, get off the bed, I'm warning you. Too many repeats? Okay, so how could they have fixed that? Say it once, give 10 seconds, see if the child stops doing it. So maybe also too, not what not to do, but what to do instead. So no jumping on the bed, please get off the bed. So give them an alternative so then you can say, oh, you listened to me, thank you. Or I like that you followed my directions, or something to try to increase compliance.
Just so I can say, it sounds like this is something that you might hear, like if the child is actively jumping on the bed and the parent is looking there and they're telling you, jump, get off the bed, and they're still jumping. So, when you're telling a parent this, you might want to, teach patience, like give them the opportunity to stop jumping, even though you just told them, give them an opportunity to stop. Because I think that might be the hardest part. It's like, okay, I literally just told him and he's still jumping in my face. So you go on with get down, now, I mean it, I'm going to get you, whatever the case may be, because they're still literally jumping on the bed right in your face.
I think a nice thing too is in isolation, there's so many different ways we could apply strategies like this, but particularly if you've been having the child come in and interact with the parent with you, you've had the opportunity to see some of the commands they may have given, to either strategically pick some or to know Do they tend to give chaining commands during an urgent situation and that's it? And this may be less of an issue, or is this their general stylistic approaches, kind of continuing to go on? So it gives us a sense of context of what our parents might be particularly struggling with. But I think that's a fair point. Number 6, thank you. Sarah, let's get started on that homework. It's the let's. And again, let's can be fine if you truly intend, let's you and I go get started on that homework. And if that's your intent, it's probably okay. If it's not your intent, it might be implying something that it's not. Number 7, yelled from the kitchen. Carl, start cleaning your room. I've got to finish these dishes.
The distance, the yelling. Go into his room, say, come do the dishes.
Okay, so the distance, the yelling, going to make visual contact with him so you're clear he understands your directions. And then number 8, Jenny, please put all of your clothes in your room, take the trash, then take these magazines out to the garbage. While you're down there, clean out the rabbit's cage. Too many chain instructions? Okay. Number 9, that's our back group. Number 9, now cut that out. Vague, okay. Number 10, Howard, do you want to help me by setting the table? Dinner's almost ready. What's what? Not really. Yeah, I just want to eat. I'd like you to set the table for me. So again, if the intent is, who are we talking about right now? Howard. If the intent is for Howard to set the table, then by asking it as a question, you give the opportunity for him to say no. If it really is genuinely a question, do you want to help set the table? Then it's probably okay. So it's just making parents aware of the language they're using and the context. Yeah. 11, Reggie, I could really use your help with the trash.
It's not a command, it's just to say, if you feel like it, you can help.
Okay, so it's not a direction, it's a statement of I could use some help. Yeah.
Sounds great, Mom, whatever.
I could really use some help with buying a Nintendo Wii. Yeah.
It almost sounds like guilt also, like I could really use some help.
So it's using it perhaps a guilt-inducing strategy rather than just being forthright with what you're telling the child to do. Okay. And then number 12. Was that this group or is that one more for you? Okay. Ginger, would you please pick up your room? Begging. Okay. Number 13, Lucy, how many times do I have to tell you don't run in the house? Question? What did you guys think? Okay, so being more obvious, don't run in the house, or you're right, it's asking is the form of the question is how many times do I have to tell you not to run in the house? And that might be a situation where if it's something the parent is repeatedly telling the child, and it might be something better formed as a house rule, that there doesn't need to be a reprimand, but it's something that there will be an immediate consequence for. Would you guys mind quieting down so we can hear the TV? So it's the question? Okay. 15, if you don't stop behaving, I'm going to drop you off at the police station. Yeah. It's vague, it's a threat. So it's vague, it's a threat. All right, next 16, behave yourself while I'm gone. Vague. What? Vague. And number 17. Were you guys number 17 or did you have one more? So, okay, so 17. If you're not out of bed in 1 minute, you'll have to miss breakfast.
Except for the current family services, that's good.
Except for calling children and family services, it's good. Oh, okay. Number 18, grandma's coming over. Make your bed and hang up your coat.
A little bit of a change.
A little bit of a chaining. So again, that might be a context one. For an older child, that might be appropriate. For a younger child, we might be setting them up for not being successful. 19, do you want a timeout? Vague in question. Okay. And number 20, put your clothes and shoes on so we can leave in 10 minutes. People like that? You okay with that? Yeah, it's developmental level again. Again, if it's an older child, that's probably appropriate. A younger child, it might be inappropriate. 21, clean up your room, Todd. Grandma's coming over and you know how she always looks in your room.
I would say grandma's coming to clean up your room.
So cut it down a little bit more specific. What were you saying?
Yeah.
Same thing? Okay. So it's a buried command. And then finally 22, Jeff, why don't you sit over there? the question, so just Jeff sit over there. Okay. So again, I hope with parents, for some parents this might be an eye-opening exercise. For others, we might strategically choose some questions. For others, we might just present it. And for others, we might just practice giving good commands. But these are things that we've heard over the years, which in and of themselves aren't implicitly wrong and bad. And it's not that parents are intentionally doing this. It's just repeated instances of these types of commands help to set the stage for non-compliance rather than compliance. Yes?
And I think too, there would be many possibly cultural issues, because some cultures typically speak in mitigating ways, and many of the bad instructions are more mitigated. So I'm thinking, for example, the Oriental culture, often they'll speak in a mitigating way.
Okay.
It's a sign of respect, and it's a way of teaching and modeling it.
You get an issue though when you get the parent from one culture of the child who's now acculturated into the mainstream culture where they look at it.
Yeah.
That's right. And it doesn't mean that you couldn't still teach it. The expectation.
Yeah, I do think it kind of opens the door for some cultural consideration and modifying your curriculum, but I also think it's important to look at it from the standpoint of, exploring with the parent, have you done this before and has it worked? If it's working for you, if it's lending itself to compliance, then it's probably not something to change, because we don't need to force everyone to speak exactly the same way. If it's not working for you or non-compliance is an issue, then we may want to look at this one antecedent-based strategy of more clearly stating your expectations for your child. And even in cultures where language is presented in more of a mitigating fashion, there might be modifications to make the assertion more clear and more definable. So, points for consideration. We talked very briefly about behavioral rules and setting up behavioral rules, and there is more content in the manual that I gave you. But are there questions that I can address about how to help parents set up behavioral rules? Okay. The biggest thing that often happens with setting up behavioral rules with families is that they can be written in ways that are unclear, or the intent is unclear to the child. And what, as therapists, we want to guide our families to do is to set up behavioral rules with the following things in mind. These are rules, if broken, would warrant an instant consequence. And we're going to be teaching parents in a later session how to do timeout, but it would really be any instant consequence for breaking a rule. So they tend to be the severity of the behaviors is a bit more intense. Sometimes the frequency can be an issue, because if parents aren't willing to give an instant consequence, even if the behavior is happening frequently, then it may not be the thing for a house rule. It's something we want them to follow through with a consequence with over and over. And we want the rules to be stated in observable, definable ways. So what might be an example of a vague rule? Behave, right. So a definable rule is one that's very clear to the child, the expectation is stated. There's been question too about, do you want to state rules in the negative or in the positive, as in no hitting, or do you want to phrase it more of keep your hands and your feet to yourself? So what the child should do versus what to do. And in some respects, I think that's a developmental consideration. For some older children specifically, they know what not hitting means, but for younger children, they may not know the opposite of what that means. And so phrasing it in a what to do way might be more appropriate. Or as you were mentioning earlier, if kids are struggling with breaking the rule, they might need more explicit instruction about what the alternative is. So if it's not don't run in the house, it's running's for outside only, or your area to run is outside. You're not allowed to run inside the house. So what I want us to do is in our subgroups, we're going to partner up again, and we're going to have one person be the therapist, one person be the parent. Yes, one person be the therapist, one person be the parent. The parent specifically, I want you to come up with 2 different household rules. And I want you to do this compliantly, meaning you're going to make the household rules. But what I would like you to do is either strategically make a vague rule or a rule that might be difficult to enforce every time, or make some strategic error, so that your therapist has the opportunity to work with you to correct and help guide a behavioral household rule. Okay, so we won't spend a huge amount of time on role playing this, but therapists, I want you to have the experience of some typical mistakes that might be made by parents and the opportunity to help guide them in the direction. Then we'll switch and do this role play again. Yes?
Are you also suggesting that the consequence should be explicitly stated in the rule? Because I noticed it here, which I haven't told.
I haven't told you to do that in the role play. If you would like to do that, yes, and that's something we'll do with parents. For the role play, really, the larger intent is helping to guide parents into making those rules, but just with the intent that it's something they'll offer a consequence for immediately. If you want to take it a step further and say, what is that consequence going to be? Absolutely, knock your socks off.
But I mean, do you propose that when you train them as something they should do, or you don't?
Again, I think that's dependent on the parent. I think particularly for a parent that's a bit forward thinking, or you're going to try this implementation, I don't think that's a bad strategy to start to introduce. I think we do need to be careful, since we haven't introduced punishment yet and what appropriate boundaries of punishment are, when we ask parents to take that extra step. So if the consequence would be an inappropriate form of punishment, we may want to wait until we get to punishment to include it. Okay? Okay. So what we just talked about in session 5, and again, it'll be up to you to make the decision about whether all of this content, I had said session 6 earlier. No wonder you were confused with the worksheet. I'm sorry. I'm already ahead in my head. Was to set house rules or ground rules or behavioral rules, and then also to make parents aware of the value of their language in giving instructions. And both of these are being done with the intent to create a more harmonious household and increase compliance generally. Session 6 then starts to get into punishment, and really focusing on defining punishment for families, and then specifically including timeout as a punishment procedure. Now, timeout for adolescents, this may be a developmental modification to make, whereas doing a 5-minute timeout with a teenager may not either feel developmentally appropriate to a parent, or may not have the potency to be at a punishment. So first we're going to talk about what punishment is, to then determine how to modify it for the different populations with whom you work. Okay, so specifically here in our ABC model, we're focusing on another consequence, and the specific strategy we'll be talking about is timeout from reinforcement as a consequence. But more globally, you could say punishment is a consequence, or punishment is anything that decreases the behavior. So when we're talking about other forms of punishment, again, that goes underneath consequence in the ABC model. And the goals of this session are to introduce the concept of punishment and its role in behavior management, to increase awareness of the negative side effects that can occur from misuse of punishment, and then finally train parents how to use timeout effectively for reducing this behavior. So again, these are 3 big goals for this session, and depending on the cognitive abilities of your parents, you may opt to split this into multiple sessions, or depending on the implementation of parents, you may opt to split it into a few sessions, or you may say, my parent seems to have understood the concept, practiced it effectively in session, and really it's time for them to go practice it with their child. One thing that I want to bring up before we get too much into punishment is I wanted to ask first why you think the theoretical, or why you think timeout is presented this late into our series of sessions. Because it gives them a chance to establish a positive relationship with their child?
Yeah, you try everything to build that cohesive relationship, and if it's not going well, it needs, then you go.
Right. The theoretical rationale is that timeout, and we'll get into this in a moment, is really timeout from positive attention, or timeout from positive reinforcement. So if there's not positive attention, if it's not a reinforcing atmosphere, the potency or the utility of timeout is decreased because they're not being timed out from anything. So that's the theoretical rationale. In practicality, in the studies that have been done that have looked at teaching timeout and punishment later in sessions versus earlier in sessions is a little mixed. Most publicly available behavioral parent training programs tend to teach timeout later for that reason. They want to start focusing on increasing the positive relationship with parents first. But I wanted to bring up that, to my knowledge, there have been 2 different studies that have looked at teaching just timeout in isolation without other behavioral strategies, and then also teaching parent-directed strategies and timeout earlier in treatment than later in treatment. And again, it's limited to just, my knowledge is limited to those 2 studies, but both had found still positive behavioral parent training results when making those modifications. And so there may be times where there is rationale for moving this up in the course of the sessions. So what might be a time where it might be more appropriate to move to effective punishment strategies and timeout earlier than waiting until that positive relationship's built? What might be?
If you're seeing that there's really inappropriate
So if we're seeing that there's inappropriate punishment being used in the home, or there's physical punishment being used in the home.
The severity of the child behavior, and also how quickly the parents are picking up the other portions of it. But sometimes you really might have to move it up, just depending on the family and the situation. But sometimes when it's really severe behaviors, you know, there's physical punishment or whatever, you know, this might be a good way for both to cool down.
Yeah. So this might be a mechanism for both parents and kids to cool down. It gives them something to use right away. So particularly if there's physical punishment, or alternatively if the child disruptive behavior is so severe that the parent's struggling with some of these early relationship building activities, they may need a strategy to use right away. Okay. Yep. And I'm bringing this up, I guess not to say like always do it this way, but just to give a sense of what we know so far, or what I know so far in the scientific literature, so that you can make appropriate decisions based upon the families with whom you're working. If there's rationale, there doesn't seem to be yet any harm in changing the order of the sessions or presenting this earlier. The rationale for why it's later is to give families that opportunity to rebuild the positive parent-child relationship and to start giving parents a chance to practice how to manage antecedents, how to influence antecedents, and to say, good behavior has occurred and I've provided attention. Behavior's occurred, I've provided attention, and start to develop more positive behaviors in their kids. So that's the theoretical rationale, but I think safely there are times where we need to shift sessions around, and this might be one that you opt to do earlier rather than later. Okay? Yes?
And the overall research suggests that the single most important reason why desired behavior, desired as in what the parent likes to do, isn't occurring is that it's not being acknowledged or imparted.
So what the statement was is another reason to produce this late is that when desired behavior or behaviors that we want to see increase in families aren't happening, typically the reason why is because attention or acknowledgement isn't being given to them.
Well, if we had to have one single reason why.
Oh, one single reason, gotcha.
Narrow it down to what would be.
The singular reason?
That would be.
Yep. Fair enough. All right, so for punishment and for timeout, punishment's a process in which an aversive event follows a behavior that decreases the frequency of that behavior. And yesterday we were talking about the difference between positive punishment and negative punishment. And I just want to reiterate that it's not subjectively the quality of the punishment that you're given, but punishment where you add something aversive that decreases a behavior is positive punishment. So if you add a chore and it decreases the behavior, that's positive punishment. Whereas negative punishment is you take something away, like a loss of a privilege following a behavior, and that decreases the behavior. So when we're talking about punishment here, regardless of whether we're talking about positive punishment or negative punishment, it's not an evaluation of what we think qualitatively the punishment is. We're talking about something happening that is aversive, that reduces the likelihood of a behavior occurring again in the future or decreases the frequency of the behavior. And this is sometimes a very confusing concept for parents, because for them, punishment is anything that they do that expresses displeasure or that they think is imparting to the child that was wrong to do. but we may need to remind parents many times that punishment is anything that's decreasing behavior or decreasing the likelihood of behavior happening. So sometimes parents may get very angry at a child, may yell at them, and they think that's punishment. And if a parent yelling at a child following a behavior, regardless of whether we ethically agree with it, if it is reducing the behavior objectively, it is punishment. If it's not reducing the behavior, it's not punishment. So oftentimes I'll hear parents say, like, I yell at him all the time for this and it just doesn't seem to make any difference. And what they're expressing to you is the frustration of they're trying to punish the behavior and it keeps happening. And sometimes saying, then yes, yelling at him is not punishment for him. It's not changing his behavior is a novel concept for parents because they're doing what they know to do or what they experienced or what they see other people doing or what their idea of punishment is. And so this may be a time that we have to come back to parents over and over again and ask the question of, is it reducing the behavior? Is what you're doing working? Is it reducing the behavior? That's the goal of punishment. The goal of punishment is not to belittle our kids. It's not to make them feel low. It's not to relieve our own anger. The goal of punishment is to change behavior and to decrease it. If it's not decreasing, what we're doing isn't punishment. And it's just as simple as that. So there is a belief that children do need punishment procedures as part of a total behavior management plan. That also includes a great deal of positive reinforcement strategies for encouraging good behavior. But punishment procedures don't need to be physical, harsh, or violent in order to be effective. And actually, when you look at singular punishment strategies like timeout, very low doses of timeout have still been shown to, when done correctly, reduce a great deal of disruptive behavior and to be effective in decreasing the likelihood of behavior continuing. So we're going to talk about some what we call effective punishment strategies, or things that have been shown to decrease the frequency or the likelihood of negative behaviors happening. Okay, so what we'll then review with parents is, when is punishment appropriate? And we want to discuss the conditions under which punishment is appropriate. It's appropriate when problem behaviors are dangerous or destructive. So it could be dangerous to the child, or dangerous to others, or destroying property. Again, behaviors that would result in harm or result in destruction of property are behaviors that we want to see decrease over time and are therefore behaviors that we want to punish. When rewards don't work because other stronger rewards are reinforcing for the problem behavior. So sometimes we'll hear parents say that the rewards that we put in place or positive attention doesn't seem to motivate him because he doesn't care. It's more important to him what his friends are doing, or it's more important to him to do this, this, and this. I don't think that those are benign statements. I think those are really valuable statements. If it's not working because something else is more motivating, good information to have. Let's use that to change the behavior that's so problematic for the family. When non-compliance or other problem behavior continues at high rates, even after the good reinforcement strategy has been instituted for in compliance. So we're doing our best with parents to teach them compliance occurs, positive behavior or positive attention follows, behavior occurs, attention follows, behavior occurs, attention follows. And so maybe in some places we are increasing compliance, but non-compliance is still happening at a very high level. And so we need to not only reinforce the opposite behavior, but start to punish that problematic behavior. And then finally, we don't use punishment procedures for negative behavior unless a positive reinforcement plan for the opposite or pro-social behavior is in effect. And that seems to be something that is important for parents to realize. If there's no replacement behavior or no other behavior that we want to see kids doing, it's very hard to punish away just that one behavior. In some respects, it's easier to punish away a behavior while reinforcing an opposite pro-social behavior. So we'll want to go through these parameters with parents. Again, if you think about the applicability of punishment in general, perhaps not timeouts as a specific punishment strategy, but punishment in general for adolescents, oftentimes getting parents to understand that point B is one that's really salient for adolescents. The attention from their peers or the want to play computer or the want to do something else is stronger than some of the reward programs that we can put into place for adolescents. So we may need a salient, potent punishment program to start to decrease those behaviors, because without that in place, the rewards we can offer just aren't cool enough or intense enough or frequent enough or potent enough to change the behavior entirely. But just because they may not be potent or intense or frequent enough to change the behavior entirely doesn't mean we don't want to have reinforcement of the pro-social opposite behavior while putting a punishment system in place for the behavior that needs to decrease. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Okay. So particularly for younger kids and elementary age kids, to an extent even middle school kids, timeout is an effective punishment strategy for reducing non-compliance and some other problematic behaviors. For adolescents, it's not that timeout just suddenly stops working, but it may seem developmentally inappropriate for adolescents, the strategies that parents don't want to do anymore, or that may cause more fighting in the adolescent. So what I'd like you to do is instead think about other punishment strategies like losing privileges, so things like negative punishment strategies, losing privileges, losing freedom, like a grounding, or positive punishment strategies like adding something, adding an extra chore for having done this. And what we'll work on with parents is creating a menu of different punishment strategies and identifying when it's a negative strategy, we're taking something away, versus a positive strategy, we're adding something with the intent of reducing that problematic behavior or that negative behavior, and systematically trying out different punishment strategies to see what's going to reduce the negative behavior. But implementing that punishment strategy would happen in the same structured way as implementing a timeout. Just instead of using a timeout, we're going to try an alternative punishment strategy. But let me come back for a second to talk about timeout, because in some ways, a grounding and a timeout are intended for the same purpose. The implementation of both timeout and the implementation of grounding both often get, the water gets muddied in terms of the implementation of it. But grounding is essentially a longer version of a timeout, and typically what's used with teens more often. So what we need to share with parents about timeout. We want to discuss with them that this is one form of punishment. It is not the only form of punishment. It's one strategy of punishment, which is a consequence. But it has been found to be effective in reducing problematic behaviors like non-compliance, which is something that plagues a lot of families. And in part why we talked so much about commands and behavioral rules in the last session, because our intent is to try to set the stage to increase compliance, and then also set the stage to start to punish non-compliance. Timeout, as I've said, is short. It's a short title for timeout from reinforcement, or timeout from attention, timeout from something that would have been rewarding previously. So it's putting a child in a low reinforcement environment or something boring. Timeout can be very effective for reducing aggressive or destructive behavior, but it also has the ancillary benefit of allowing kids to calm down or to cool down, particularly when they've gotten physiologically aroused or really angry. The primary intent of timeout is not to offer that cool down period, but is to present a stark contrast between a rewarding environment and a boring environment to set the stage for that behavior is not being rewarded, it's being punished. And what we want you to do is review if parents have used timeout procedures to date, and point out that some approaches to using timeout aren't effective, like the child deciding when they have cooled down and when they're going to end timeout, or sitting with kids in timeout and talking about cool down strategies during a timeout. So things that may have sabotaged, not intentionally, but may have sabotaged the effectiveness of timeout. So we'll want to talk with parents about what have they done and how did it work for them in the past.
I've heard that the best timeout, it's 1 minute for the individual child. And because, a 6-year-old is not going to be able to, like a 6-year-old should have 6 minutes, pretty much. That's what I heard. A 10-year-old, 10 minutes, because for a 6-year-old, 10 minutes is probably 10 years, you know, in their time, you know, so it has to be more realistic.
Yeah, and I don't think that's a bad rule of thumb, a minute for each year of age that the child is. It probably keeps it within a developmental time frame. We know from studies of kids with developmental delays and some moderate mental retardation that even timeouts as brief as 10 or 15 seconds are still effective in reducing non-compliant or aggressive behaviors, so timeouts can be really brief. We've also in studies strategically looked at longer and longer timeouts. So a child goes into timeout, if they misbehave, we increase the length of timeout. They misbehave again, increase the length of timeout. And with the exception of a very small subset of kids, timeout that keeps increasing in length doesn't seem to be any more effective than just a flat rate timeout. So saying you're 10, you have a 10-minute timeout doesn't seem to change behaviors any greater than saying, oh, you just messed up again, now another 5 minutes. Oh, you just messed up again, another 5 minutes. So what I would encourage parents to do is to choose a realistic period of time that they can do a timeout. If they can, every time a negative behavior, not every time a negative behavior happens, but every time the behavior for which they would use a timeout would happen, if they can consistently and effectively do a 2-minute timeout, and they say, I could do that every time, I don't know if I could do a 10-minute timeout every time, I would start there, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of rationale that longer, more intensive timeouts work any better than shorter, briefer timeouts. There was a question somewhere, yes?
What about the parent? This happens to me a lot when they say, oh, timeout doesn't work. Every time I try to tell them to go to timeout, they won't go. They refuse to go.
Yep.
Would suggesting every minute you refuse to go is another minute in timeout? Or what are the suggestions? Because I have given some, and they keep coming back. Well, it's not working.
Well, it's not working. Yeah, let's go through some more timeout procedures and see if we can't answer that, and then we'll come back to it again, because I hear that a lot too myself of, well, they just won't go to their timeout area. Yeah. So let's talk about some strategies for A, getting them to go to a timeout area, and then B, about the importance or the utility of even having a timeout area. Okay. So the procedures for setting up a timeout, and again, I want to emphasize that this is provided for you as a template from which to work, and it has been shown to be an effective timeout procedure. But I want to honor that there are going to be times or situations in which modifications need to be made to this depending on the child or the family with whom you're working. So the first is selecting target behaviors for timeout. Oftentimes what we see parents doing is using timeout reactively, or using timeout when they get pissed off enough. Like, you've just crossed this threshold in my mind and you just need to have a timeout now. But having parents identify ahead of time for which behaviors will you get a timeout, and I will use a timeout each and every time, and for which behaviors will you not. And that can be adjusted, but it's adjusted systematically, not just on the fly when the parent's feeling frustrated. So first, working with parents to select which behaviors would warrant a timeout. And the extent to which these will mirror what their behavioral rules are should be pretty great. So if they have a behavioral rule in place, it's because they're either offering a timeout or some other consequence right away. The next is determining the location of the timeout. And this may be a time to explore with parents locations for when they're out of the house. So if you're in the car, if you're at the grocery store, where are other areas where you see high frequency rates of behavioral rules being broken, or high frequency rates of aggression or destruction, where we may need to do a timeout, but it's not in your home? Where would an appropriate timeout place be? The other thing that you want to assess for is the appropriateness of the timeout location. So again, I know we all know this, but just so we're being vocal about it, where are inappropriate places for timeout?
Their room, if they have a lot of stuff in there.
So if they got a lot of stuff to play with in a location, their room would be one. I worked with a teacher once doing some behavioral consultation in her class, and she had this really fantastic area for well, she was using it for timeout, but it had couches and bean bags and books, and you got to sit next to the rabbit in class and pet the bunny, and one of the very simple, yeah, it was great. The kids loved it. They got into timeout all the time. So one of the very simple changes we made was to make it into a very boring, neutral area of the classroom and make that an access area for good behavior rather than for timeout. But again, a lot of parents just say, go to your room, without realizing that there's access to a lot of really enjoyable activities. And if there's access to enjoyable activities, then we have not timed kids out from reinforcement. We've just provided them access to reinforcement. So what might be some, oh yes, I'm sorry. Putting them in the bathroom would be bad or good?
I think especially when they're in the process of potty training, I've advised against that, just so that they don't have a negative association with the bathroom.
Yep. I think you're bringing up another point too, is timeout doesn't need to be a scary place or an unsafe place. So, you know, we don't want parents to put kids in the bathroom and turn out the lights or scare them or say you have to go in the basement. Really the intent is for that, I'm just speaking of things we've worked with before, but we want the timeout to be a place that's very boring, not scary, not physically frightening for them or unsafe, but boring is the key.
I think we also need to be, because I know most people, you know, a lot of people live in a this big, one bedroom, and then there's 5 kids, and parents. So if you're gonna do that, let's say they do it in the corner in the living room, they're not gonna send them to the room, there's too much stimuli. All the other kids have to go in the room, and then they have to turn off the TV, turn off all the stimuli, because we have to look at the location. Because I particularly have a parent, she's a single parent, 1 bedroom, and she has 5 kids. So, you know, that's going to be a little bit harder.
It is, absolutely.
When there's all that stuff going on. So,
absolutely, that's going to be harder.
You know, timeout sometimes not going to be effective for that kind of situation.
Right, and I think what you're doing is you're thinking like a good behaviorist. So if timeout is not timeout from enjoyable activity, it's not going to work. So we either have to get through the barriers of what's making it an enjoyable activity or choose a different punishment strategy, because you're right, if it's not timeout from reinforcement, if kids are going to get equal amounts of reinforcement during timeout, then let's not waste our energy and our parents' frustration on doing something that may not logistically work. Let's try a different punishment strategy. That being said, timeout, when done well, is an effective strategy. So we also want to look at, are there ways we can reduce those barriers to implementation of timeout. So like where your head's at, like where you're thinking. Yep.
And when you say implementation of timeout, in all likelihood the parent needs to be someplace that they can easily supervise and become, if it's possible, not a major imposition on them and their activity. So if the parent doesn't have a visual on the child, they may be just setting themselves up for further compliance issues.
And particularly for younger children, we may still need to provide supervision so the child's safe. So it's somewhere that can be monitored but is not a huge imposition for the child. So we may want to spend some time exploring the application of where timeout can happen.
I don't know if this is premature, but has any study been done about the delivery of the request? Meaning, is it done in a neutral fashion or a harsh fashion?
Neutral fashion.
I know, that's what's recommended. Has any study been done that shows a difference?
There has been, but you'd be surprised. Most people study timeout as a set of procedures. There have been fewer what we call dismantling studies, which is let's look at the individual components of timeout that may contribute or take away from its effectiveness. Most studies have been, let's look at timeout as an entity and how is it effective. Oh no, sorry. Am I running over on time? No. Okay, just checking. So determination of location of timeout. This is something we'll want to explore with parents to assess those boundaries. Patterson in his books, he strongly advises the use of the bathroom, light on, but because it is such a boring place to be, and particularly in small locations. So that might be one to suggest to families, but again, that's going to be something that families need to decide, can they use it or not. The next one is we want to set up the length of timeout, and we've touched on this a bit, but this would apply too for groundings. So if parents are going to ground their kids, we want them to determine ahead of time what's the standard length of grounding, rather than I am so mad at you right now that you have a grounding for 2 weeks. And 2 weeks is more a reflection of my anger than it is a reflection of what you did or the consequence. So if we're using something like a reduction in freedom, or you can't go out with your friends because of something, we still want to set up these same procedures. So what's their location? If they're grounded to the house, define what the house is. Or are they grounded to your property? Are they allowed to go out in the yard? Are they grounded to your street? So coming up with parents ahead of time, what does grounding mean to them? Are kids, when they're grounded, allowed to watch television or to use the phone or to use the computer? So what access do they have and do they not have? And setting that up with parents ahead of time. Again, length of timeout in lower functioning populations of kids, we've found that it can be quite brief. And in typically developing kids, there's not much evidence that says longer timeouts are more effective than shorter timeouts, or timeouts that keep increasing in length may not be more effective than shorter timeouts. That's certainly not true for every child. For a small subset of kids, we may need to ramp up our timeout length. But for most kids, a brief, contained, manageable timeout for the parent probably is going to be equally effective as a more protracted timeout. Then we want to set up the rules for timeout. So the physical boundaries of where the child's allowed to and not allowed to go. The condition of timeout, that's what I was saying earlier. We want the conditions to be safe, just boring, not unsafe or scary. And then finally, we want the parent ahead of time to set up rules about talking or noise making in timeout. Is the child allowed to talk to themselves? Are they allowed to hum to themselves? Or do they have to sit, on a chair silently? And again, the child is to be removed from positive attention and from positive reinforcement. So talking to their sibling during timeout, probably not a great idea. Talking to themselves, entertaining themselves in timeout, battling about that struggle probably exacerbates behaviors more than it does to serve. So it's removal of attention from external sources. Setting up consequences for failure to go to timeout or failure to follow timeout rules. So for some families that might be lengthening the timeout, but for others it might be your timeout is still going to end, but now you have an additional chore, or you have a different type of consequence for not having followed the timeout rules. And then finally, 2 conditions need to be met prior to ending a timeout. First, the specified timeout should be signaled by a timer or by the parent noting the time. It's not just when I feel like it. There's some indication of when timeout is over or grounding is over. And then finally, the child should be following all the timeout rules set for at least a minute prior to the release of timeout. And we'll touch on the implementation of this a bit more. And last but not least, if the child went to timeout for noncompliance, for not following directions, then we should reissue that direction or reissue that command so that they have the opportunity to change course and get a lot of attention for having done so, or to see that there's a consistent punishment for not having done so.
You skip when to warn and not to warn.
When to warn, when to warn. Typically what we tell parents is that when they've given a command to their child or a direction to their child, if the child doesn't do it the first time, it's appropriate to give a warning, just in the event that the child didn't hear, didn't finish, didn't get started fast enough, but to give them the opportunity for compliance and positive attention rather than time out right away. When not to warn is when kids would be breaking a house rule, or if there are reasons for timeout like aggression or destruction of property, whether those are house rules or not, those would be things the first time it happened, it needs to have an immediate consequence. So the warning is typically, I'm giving you a chance to correct your behavior, or you didn't follow through with my command, this is your chance to fix it because perhaps you didn't hear, perhaps I yelled the command from downstairs, maybe I didn't say it clearly. It gives both people a chance to self-correct. Okay? Can address questions? Sure. No, that's okay.
Going back to the beginning for a second, would you, if the child's at the developmental age in terms of understanding, and you can have a conversation with the child, would you explain to them at the beginning that the parent is going to engage in this program? Because if all of a sudden their parent starts doing these things with them, they're like, why are you even doing this?
Yeah.
You're thinking of a pre-adolescent or adolescent. Yeah. Why are you even paying attention to it? Why are you, should you tell the parent to explain to the child, okay, I'm going to participate, or find a way to explain
Yeah.
to them.
Yes and no. I don't think it's ever bad to communicate with kids and to share with them and to even acknowledge, you know, stuff's not going that great for us at home. I'm going to be working on changing things with you, and I hope you'll work on changing things with me, making a more positive relationship. But you know, for some kids, they just may be too young, not get it. And I also would say that even if kids are like, why are you talking to me this way, or why are you doing it this way, doesn't mean it won't work in the long term. It will feel different to kids. We hope it does feel different. And different sometimes can be uncomfortable, but different doesn't mean that it's ineffective. So you might also prep parents for that. You know, kids might say, why are you playing with me like this, or why are you talking to me like this, until it becomes natural for them as well. But certainly for older kids, if parents have frank conversations with them and say that they're going to try to change some of their own behaviors, it's not wrong. The other thing that can happen is kids can sometimes say things like, oh,
You're only
doing this because, yeah. So I would just prep parents for knowing that they may not get the response that they hope for. Yeah.
In response to that potential response from the
Sure.
child of, oh, you're only doing this because the therapist told you or something like that. I think maybe another way that they could inform them that there's something that's going to be different is just saying just that, you know, we're going to be making some changes around here, you know, because I think that things are not going very good. So I'm going to make some changes, and I'm going to expect you to also make some changes as well. And then just kind of leave it at that and not really explain exactly where it's coming from, just for the potential negative backlash that you might get from more of a rebellious reaction.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm thinking the child will lash out and like, totally challenge.
Like, this is not you, this is, you're just listening to what they're doing.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah. And then I know.
One of the in setting rules, then the age appropriateness of I see when you have like family who might have a teenager and a 12 or 13-year-old, and then one is 8 and one is 3, and you have that age and the different developmental issues going on. Sometimes it's a challenge.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
And sometimes with kids with multiple age, or families with multiple age kids, timeout with one child might look very different than timeout with another child. But those are the considerations that we have to work with. Yeah.